Hey everyone, welcome. Can everybody see our presentation? Welcome everyone. Great. Well, hey everyone, I'm Kelly from Republic. I'm joining from New York. I would love to hear where you guys are joining from in the chat. Please feel free to introduce yourself to one another and let us know where you're coming in from. We're happy to have you here. We're going to just give people another minute to join outer space. I see someone is joining us, maybe Mars. Love that. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Oh, Ken and Chuck said to say hello. Someone from our team here. Okay, we'll give everybody just another 30 seconds, then we'll dive in. All right, everyone, it seems like we have a quorum here. Glad that you're all joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about investing in space with Boris and Mo from the Republic Capital team. We're excited that they're here. My name is Kelly. I am a marketing director here at Republic, and I am just happy to be hosting these two to guide us on investing in space. So I'm going to give you guys a brief introduction to Boris and Mo and then kind of kick it off. And Mo works on our Republic Capital team as head of research and is the co-founder of Payload, a media firm covering the business and policy of the space industry. Payload is read by some of the world's leading new space companies, investors, and policymakers. We're also joined by Boris. Boris is the head of private capital at Republic Capital, a registered investment advisor with over 1 billion in assets under management as of December 2nd of last year. Boris has led Republic Capital investments into Robinhood, Relativity Space, Klarna, Avalanche, and many others. Prior to Republic Capital, Boris was a partner at Game Theory Group. He is also the director of the Board of Tailwind Two. And just to reiterate, I am Republic's marketing director and I work for Open Deal. Please make note of this disclosure and disclaimer slide. This is not investment advice. We're just here to have a fun educational chat and for discussion purpose only. Just please make note of this slide. Thank you, everyone. So before we jump in to the exciting investment opportunities and what to look for, I'm going to kick it off to Boris and Mo to go into their background, give us a brief introduction on this space industry and how we got here today.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone. I see we're still ticking up on participants, nearing a couple hundred. So some quick background on myself. As Kelly mentioned, I'm a managing director here at Republic Capital. I'm an entrepreneur. I was a computer science dropout from UMass Amherst. I started a company with a few friends back at school in advertising technology, so about as far from space as you can get, hopefully forever. But quickly sort of started building the company, first as an engineer, the CTO, CEO, et cetera. We sold the company in 2015. Started another company, which eventually became a property technology company that's its own unicorn. But I have taken time over the last few years to become an investor, first at Game Theory Group, where I was investing my own money, and then about 3 years ago, helped launch Republic Capital. Republic Capital is, many folks here probably know, is under the Republic umbrella. So you can visit us at republiccapital.co and you can find Republic at republic.com. So what does Republic Capital do? We're investors in 3 different sectors: fintech, so Kelly mentioned Robinhood; crypto, very well versed; and then deep tech, which is where we're super interested, and I'm excited to have Mo join us. And we pulled Mo onto our team kicking and screaming, where he was running space investing, and he'll tell you all about what he was up to, including Payload. So we invested here at Republic Capital, and I've invested in several sectors, not all the sectors that are available to space, but in particular, we were interested in launch services, which is basically how the rockets get out into orbit, satellite operations and communications, how they talk to each other, and then space infrastructure, think space stations. Mo, why don't you give your background?
Sure. Thanks, Boris, and thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Mo Islam, and my background will be a little bit thinner than Boris's here, but I started my career on Wall Street in New York. That's where I spent most of my time, and then about a year ago, co-founded Payload, which is a newsletter-centric digital media business covering the business and policy of the space industry, and I also help lead research at Republic Capital. But to kind of jump right into things, because more interesting than our backgrounds is what's happening in the space industry today. I think that to kind of start off with Kelly's question, I think if we really look back at the first 2 decades of the space age, really starting in the 50s, NASA and the Soviet Union achieved a huge amount of success racing to the moon, right? And in the process, developed a whole host of new technologies. I think one thing that we might all kind of remember seeing is that iconic photo of Buzz Aldrin, saluting the flag on the moon, which became sort of this iconic symbol of human advancement and innovation. But in the decades following the moon landing, we hit significant political friction. I don't think many people know this, but there's a solid chance, and I really firmly believe this, that we could have gone to Mars many years ago. I think Wernher von Braun, who is often considered sort of the father of rocketry in the US, the man who built the Saturn V rocket, which actually ended up taking us to the moon, talked about colonizing Mars way back in the 60s, right? And actually overbuilt the Saturn V. So the Saturn V actually was more powerful than it needed to be to get us to the moon, but it's sort of reflective of what his ultimate goal was, which was getting to the moon. That's what his, you can read a lot of his early work, and his goal was always Mars. And I think if you look at Elon Musk's inspiration for SpaceX and aerospace engineer Dr. Robert Zubrin, he talks about this pretty frequently. How there was a major failure of political leadership starting with the Nixon administration. NASA had plans to have a moon base in the 70s, land on Mars in the early 80s, and effectively have a permanent base by like 1988. And I think with a politically coordinated effort, like what we saw in the Apollo era, as crazy as it sounds, I think we could have done it. But instead, what you saw was budgets for human spaceflight fall and become terribly inefficient. And the price of launch, the primary driver and cost for space activity, remain relatively stagnant for decades. Then, of course, we all know Elon Musk comes along and proves that a hungry, driven entrepreneurial team could achieve rocket reusability in a fraction of the time and cost that government agencies could do it. I mean, some government agencies said it was impossible, right? So launch costs started to come down significantly. The cost of building satellites started to become commoditized. And on the policy side, NASA launches a program called COTS in 2006. So COTS stands for Commercial Orbital Transportation Services. And what it did was it opened up the delivery of cargo to the International Space Station by private companies. And this effectively represented the first time where you saw this kind of cooperation between NASA and commercial space, something like we've never seen before. And then billions of venture capital dollars later, we've gone to this point where space investing has become more accessible and easier than it ever has been before. So yeah, so that was me trying to summarize 70 years of history in about 5 minutes. I know I missed something. So if anyone in the chat is saying, hey, well, you missed this and this, I certainly have, but hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of how we got here today.
Thank you, Mo. And I think when we talk about investing in space, it's possible to put it sort of into context with other sectors. The way that I think about space investing is similar to how I think about biotech or life science investing. They're, of course, completely different products, but there are so many similarities. And I think with the emergence of COVID, so many more people are paying attention to the regulatory oversight of some of these treatments and cures. And so we think about space in a similar way. How? Well, the outcomes are often binary. Your rocket either works or it doesn't. Your cancer treatment either works or it doesn't. Now, you might need to iterate quite a few times to get there, but there are binary outcomes in a lot of these things. And so when you see space companies at any part of the sort of supply chain or sector generating revenue, real revenue, you know that something has worked. Before that, especially in private investing, you know that oftentimes they're still in deep R&D. That means large investments pre-revenue, especially in the private sector. It can take tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, much like in the biotech space, to actually get to the point where you can even test your rocket or test your satellite or test your space station. And because of that, these are very challenging things to evaluate, right? You can't just give it a very simple next year's revenue multiple and get to where you need to get to. Also, there's a lot of value in the IP. So even if your engine works, but the rest of your rocket doesn't, some parts of your deployment work, others don't, that doesn't mean that your space tech company is worth zero. And it's important to look at the assets and the IP and the technology and the team that help develop it when you value these companies. And then finally, there's just a high degree of regulatory oversight. You can't just send anything you want into space, not and get away with it. If you think about the FDA and biotech, you think about the FCC, NASA, and all these other folks. Remember, what a lot of people don't understand is that in the manufacturing process and the launch process, there are often engineers and regulators present at the launches, before the launches, at the tests. All of this stuff has to happen pretty safely. The last thing you want, cough China a little bit, is for your satellite to be coming down before it reaches orbit or even at the end of life and not know where it's going to land. All of that stuff really does have to get modeled in advance. So that's kind of how we think about space broadly, investing both privately and publicly.
Yeah, so I think to Boris's point, I mean, in addition to launch, which is just sort of like kind of one of the four verticals that I think help summarize the opportunity set, you have satellite operators, right? These are the companies that are building satellite systems and constellations for various services, most often for Earth use, right? So this could be imaging data, right? Optical, infrared, radar, that basically satellites take in orbit and then sell to government or commercial customers. It could be communication satellites that are relaying TV or radio signals, broadband operators like Starlink that provide satellite-based internet, weather satellites that provide climate data. That list goes on, but that's like satellite operators. I would say the next kind of verticals are the supply chain. So these are component manufacturers that build equipment, oftentimes specialized equipment like phased array antennas or satellite radios, or suppliers of rocket engines. And then I'd say finally, and this is a bit of a newer vertical, which we'd call space or in-space infrastructure, right? These are companies building stations or outposts used to conduct research, for tourists to go visit, to engage in manufacturing activity. These are really, I would call, second or third order effects of the new commercial space industry. And it is important, though, I think these four verticals are what we're seeing today. I think it's important to asterisk all this because we're confident that many more business models that we haven't even seen yet could become a reality, right? This is an industry that's innovating very quickly, and it's important to keep an open mind on where it could go.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for that background. I would love for us to dive straight into kind of the commercial industry you touched on a little bit. So Boris, do you want to start us off and talking a little bit about what the commercial space industry looks like today?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the opportunity. Again, we're talking about investing. Wall Street Journal put out some language around a $350 billion market. The government's or the US government thinks it's a little smaller, $200 to $250 billion. Morgan Stanley, obviously a bank, put out research saying it could get to 1 trillion by 2040. The thing about the size of the space market is that it's growing because the commercial efforts are growing, and you're starting to see commercial contracts get almost up to par with government contracts. And so it's really hard to estimate how big this thing is because a lot of the companies are still private, right? When they go public and retail investors can get into it, there's going to be a lot more data about how big these companies really can get. We're very bullish on the market size. What's most important to us is that the market is growing and that there's still an opportunity for some categories to have winner take most capabilities. And so that's super interesting. And if you just look at SpaceX, the public private valuations are pretty substantial here. I mean, we're talking about a private company potentially worth almost $100 billion privately. So we'll see what happens if and when it goes public and other companies follow suit. But we have seen Elon Musk shatter a lot of glass ceilings in that specific category. When we think about investing, there's sort of 4 key categories that we are considering. And I'll talk about the first one, and Mo will talk about the others, because I do want to show a place where perhaps private investing will soon taper out and public investing can begin. So many folks on this chat, if you're signing in, you probably know about Rocket Lab's Electron sending 300-kilogram rockets into space. You've got Relativity Space and some competitors like Firefly, potentially sending 1,000-kilogram rockets into space. And then you've got Falcon 9 and all of SpaceX's other rockets. Those are 10,000 kilograms all the way up to 100,000 kilograms plus Starship. And then, you've got Blue Origin, also really large deployment capabilities. They are so big now that often they're sharing space. So multiple companies will put satellites into one rocket. So that's super interesting, all the technology around deployment. But it's a good example of where Mo and I and Republic Capital see private investing as not quite a settled matter, but it's starting to get there, meaning all of the news about all this stuff that's actually all the companies that are launching stuff into space, a lot of that technology has been deployed. A lot of that technology is nearing, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. So who's going to want to compete necessarily, especially in the United States? Also, physical space. I mean, you can launch little rockets out of the back of a truck in the desert, but you can't launch 10,000 kilograms out of the back of a truck. It's got to go somewhere in a platform. And so in Cape Canaveral and other launch sites, there's just literally not a lot of physical space. It's expensive and the government has to let you in, more or less. And so when we think about one sector where we've made a lot of investments early, and we do think we've got some interesting companies in the portfolio, and we are, of course, we're not naive to think no newcomer can come in and really develop new tech. We believe that the next opportunity for launch services is probably in the public arena. And I'll let Mo talk about the stuff that we're sort of turning our eye into where we see the most opportunity.
Yeah, so kind of touching on what I had mentioned earlier. So I think the 4 verticals that we're kind of thinking about again is launch, which Boris just mentioned, satellite operators. Again, those are just satellites that are up in orbit that are taking pictures of Earth or communicating with each other or communicating with Earth, whether it's through TV or radio or broadband. Supply chain is another, I think, key category. I think we'll talk about it in greater detail later. And I think finally, the newer vertical on space infrastructure and space stations. There's clearly companies that don't necessarily fit in this vertical. Like you might be thinking of space tourism, right? The Virgin Galactics of the world that are out there that are trying to make space tourism a large industry. I think if you really look at the numbers, to kind of back into what Boris mentioned on 300 to 400 billion, if you really look at what space tourism is, it's very, very, very small segment. I mean, today it's basically it's not even like any real revenue, but I would say even when it becomes a mature industry, I think you're still looking at sub-single digit percentages of the entire space economy. So we don't necessarily put it into its own vertical. It's just not big enough. It's possible that in 10, 20 years, that the cost structures start to look interesting. But for now, I'd say the 4 verticals again: launch, satellite operations, supply chain, and then space infrastructure.
Right. Those are really interesting. We have a lot of questions in the chat and then some thoughts on this too. So how do you guys evaluate or go about evaluating opportunities within these different verticals? Yeah,
I'll take this one. So I think, it's not easy. Space is a very, very technical, very technical field. And I think space startups in general, when they're raising capital at the Series A or Series B, they typically don't have the financial metrics that your typical technology startup would have at that at that stage, right? So if you're an early investor, you're often looking and deciding between companies that don't have any revenue at all. It's possible that they have these beautiful renderings, designs, visuals of a very cool product, and some abstract level of contract agreement. So like whether it's MOUs or LOIs, which are letters of intent, but those don't always equate to recognized revenue. And it's really important to, as an investor, that you pay attention to that. So what is it that you do look for? I think in its simplest construct, there's really 3 things that I think you can point to. I think the first is commercial viability. The second is the technical risk behind the company. And then the third is the team. So if we were to just touch on the commercial viability, I think you need to ask yourself, is it a first order solution? Or is it a service that requires like one or two other levels of the space economy to develop to become a viable business model? So for example, is it a satellite imaging business that can launch a satellite, effectively tomorrow and immediately generate revenue from customers? Or are you looking at something like gas stations in space, right, that require there to be a robust economy of satellites that have traveled long enough and now actually need more fuel, right? That idea clearly depends on this sort of layer one economy coming into fruition first. And that doesn't mean it's a good or bad thing, right? But it helps you understand what the timeline looks like. The second is, of course, technical risk. Is it a company that's iterating on an existing piece of technology? Is it an improvement on, for example, an existing propulsion system? Or is it a completely novel new idea, right? Is it like something like space-based solar power? And then finally, I think the team is really important. Space is a very technical field. Who are the people that are doing this? What's their pedigree? Don't fall into the trap of like, oh, this person worked at SpaceX or Blue Origin, which must mean that they're amazing enough to build this business. And not to take away anything from any of those people, they're wildly smarter than I am. But there's also 15,000 employees between both of those companies, right? So you have to ask yourself, what did those individuals do at those organizations and what it really means for their experience running a business, right? And again, you have to take all three of these things in concert. So commercial viability, technical risk, and team. And we are oversimplifying, but at least from a kind of framework and construct perspective, you should be asking yourself those questions.
Yeah, so with that in mind, what are some of the most exciting and compelling opportunities that you are seeing to invest in space today?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. It's a good question. I think it's time to geek out a little bit. So Earth observation, a lot of people, from conspiracy theorists to professional, scientists know that there's quite a bit of Earth observation going on from satellites in space. And as satellite manufacturing and image processing becomes cheaper, it's both hardware and software. It's important to understand because this technology is not brand new. We had it up there for, many, many decades, but now it's becoming super interesting in the last, call it 15 years. So Earth observation allows you to basically create this live catalog of Earth in a way that hasn't been possible. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you combine geolocation data with satellite imagery, big companies like Fortune 500 companies, and many that you would think would never have satellites in space or shared satellites in space, are monitoring all their commercial activity from space. So tracing supply chains, an especially important problem to solve right now, obviously with the supply chain issues that are going on. Monitoring their assets on the ground. So literally being able to see if stuff is going in the right direction, why or why not. And then what a lot of people don't consider, evaluating competitors, especially governments evaluating competitors, but also commercial groups basically seeing what their competitors are doing, both to copy what they're doing and to prevent them from doing something nefarious. A lot of money is spent on that. You think about optical imagery. So natural disasters like wildfires and deforestation. The insurance companies that are then going in and assessing that stuff, they don't monitor everything on the ground going through every single acre. There are ways for them to cut costs and be way more efficient and effective. And then, things that are really important to individuals and people in general, like search and rescue, for example. Like it's a lot easier to find someone or find something going wrong if you're looking at it from space. And then as part of that is a subsector, this thing called SAR, synthetic aperture radar, basically allows satellites to image Earth in nighttime with cloud coverage, with precipitation, places that are really hard to see. And that technology is becoming extremely interesting. Couple of examples for this specific need: military, right? So just think of like tanks moving at night. Think about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Every night, Russia is moving assets. And how do you keep track of what's going on with regular satellites? It's really, really hard, believe it or not. But with SAR, you can actually see through that and through cloud cover and all this other cool stuff. That takes a lot of software, takes a lot of hardware. You need to have fast refresh rates, so the satellites need to move quickly. And a lot of that technology is just starting to get really big, and we think it's going to get a lot bigger. And then think about, again, things like crop yields in Africa and places where you might not be able to see things as easily with regular satellites. Synthetic aperture can help solve those problems. So that's where we're really excited. Again, from launch services, those SpaceX and Relativity Space, awesome companies to take stuff into orbit. Once you're in orbit, that's where the fun stuff happens. And that's where a lot of people aren't paying attention, and we think they should be, and we're definitely paying attention.
Right, and I'd add a few more to Boris's point. I think companies that are helping fix supply chains, I think that's an important category to look at. I think aerospace supply chains, especially in the US, it's very, very fragmented. And it's been this product of strategic manufacturing decisions in the past that created a very heavy concentration in the front end. So think like the defense primes, like the Northrops and the Lockheeds of the world, and then significant fragmentation from suppliers of like key parts, and that's like the lower tiers. So a lot of large aerospace companies rely on thousands of small, like kind of inefficient machine shops. Companies that are automating and vertically integrating those manufacturing processes are certainly worth paying attention to. At a higher level, I think space infrastructure businesses that are building sort of the next gen of orbiting space stations are exciting. There are definitely challenges to the business models, but there is a lot of government data on the willingness of what agencies can and want to pay for that access. Not to mention that I think there's newer commercial business models around it that are forming. And I think the last thing I'll just touch on is orbital debris is starting to become a very, very real issue. Because with all of this like great stuff that's happening, new satellites being launched, commercial activity in general is hitting this inflection point. We broke satellite launch records this past year, and we still have these near-term plans to launch tens of thousands of satellites into orbit. Russia recently conducted, not too long ago, conducted an anti-satellite missile test that added significant amounts of debris in orbit. And we've just had a lot of near misses with the ISS. And it's only a matter of time before we have an incident in space that starts, forces government to create some type of regulation and open up business models for companies that are either building software for risk management in orbit, or even companies that are looking to physically remove that debris. Though I would say those business models are still, I think, up in the air of whether they work. There's going to be a need for the product. So it's just an inevitability. At some point, there's going to be some debris that hits some important asset, and everyone sort of starts to really worry what kind of next order impact that could have.
Yeah, thank you guys. That was really a fascinating nerd out we did. Which brings me to my next question. It seems like you guys mentioned and touched on a few technical topics as we were kind of going into that, and you guys obviously do a lot of research. How can investors who maybe don't have the time or the materials to do that kind of technical research invest in space well and feel good about those investments?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Kelly. I think that you have to be very careful just trying to momentum trade these space stocks, because they can go up really high and down really quickly. So my view on the following is look at the teams that are behind these companies, because it's not enough to build really cool tech. It needs to be commercially viable, as Mo said. And then most importantly, you need to be able to get the contracts, both commercial and government. If you don't have any ex-armed forces folks on the team, then they probably aren't experts at navigating that process. So you might have the coolest widget that never gets used. So be very careful, I think, following the example of Elon Musk. He is an edge case. You want to find seasoned teams, and you want to find teams that have done the kind of work that this company promises to do. And from my perspective, you want to make sure that they have won the contracts that they want to win. When you're thinking about investing, you also want to look at the investor base and whether or not are they selling or buying the stock, whether it's public or private. We look for scientific investors, and sadly, those are usually not the biggest checks. So you'll have the traditional VCs or the traditional private equity firms. Holy crap, they led with 300 million. Where are the scientific investors that came in and did the hardcore due diligence that is required, and are they putting in their hard-earned money? Those are usually smaller funds. Sometimes they're corporate funds. So just keep that in mind. And you actually want to look at the investor base. I don't know if a lot of people do that. Couple things. I wouldn't invest only on emotions, but at the same time, if you're a space retail investor, I think it's perfectly legitimate to invest in what you want to see happen in the world. And I think that's part of what's so interesting about SPACs and these alternative ways of financing for space companies. Like, it's hard to value them, but I think retail is really interested in it. And I think the retail revolution is going to make possible what probably wouldn't have been possible, right? You talk a lot about the space race moved innovation forward. I actually think alternative financing and all that things that are happening in fintech and crypto and regulatory, that's going to bring in sort of a new massive growth in technology, especially in space. And we're really excited about that. So I really do think retail should strongly consider, and we strongly consider, space investing generally, as long as you're careful about how you look at it. It's not just another YOLO stock. You should peel back the covers.
Totally. Thank you for touching on that, Boris. We mentioned this really briefly. I'd love for you to just cover it and dive into it for a quick minute, and then we can get into some Q&As. So remember, everyone, submit your Q&As on the panel there. But and maybe I can just throw this back to you, Boris, briefly. There's a lot of discussion within the space industry and record amounts of venture capital raised in space IPOs and SPACs. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing with space investing is that that's a category itself that's growing. So people that are interested in space and have the capital to invest and have the capital to invest at the growth stage, that's where you run into problems. There are plenty of space seed funds that are getting launched. But what if the company then needs $200-300 million and they want to get a valuation that they think makes sense for the founders and the team to continue to innovate, right? Because innovation is part of the game. And I think that's where SPACs are really interesting, because they can raise a substantial amount of money and have retail be literally the force that drives that innovation. And I know that it's hard to see around a corner, right? So, right now, whether you like the performance of SPACs or the stock market in general, I think that if you're a long-term investor, which we definitely are privately and publicly, for myself, I think that there's big rewards to be gained really sticking it through. So my view on SPACs is it's deep pools of capital that bring retail into the game of space. And I think it's important for the United States. I think it's important for the world. And I think the most interesting thing is that commercial companies are so much more efficient than most governments and regulatory agencies with how they spend their money. And so I think we should take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I think just to add on that, it's really exciting to see what's happening in the public markets. We're still seeing record amounts of venture capital flow into the industry. I think liquidity, which was one of the biggest issues for investors in aerospace and defense in general, is starting to shift now as public investors have effectively expressed their interest and willingness to fund R&D costs. It's quite similar to the biotech analogy that Boris mentioned earlier. I think for all the potential investors on this call, I don't think there's going to be a lack of ways to invest in space. You're going to see opportunities within Republic's ecosystem and public markets. There are now many ways to get exposure to verticals that were really never accessible before, and arguably at better cost today than even 6 months ago. And I'd say there are really two important things to keep in mind. I think one, obviously, be really critical and remember time horizons. Companies in this industry inevitably take longer to hit their metrics or milestones, and you need to have a long-term view, right? There's just so many examples of this. And the second piece is space is really hard, right? And it comes with enormous technical and execution risks and challenges. If you want exposure and this is not an area of expertise for you, it's really important to size those positions accordingly. But having said that, we're in this very exciting time in the history of human civilization, as cheesy as it sounds. It's true. I have never seen an industry with this kind of potential, and we're certainly, I would say definitely at the cusp of massive societal changes at how we view space, the impact on it on our everyday lives, and we hope that we can continue having this sort of front row seat on all the action.
Awesome. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, Boris, both for that insightful talk. We're going to get into some of the Q&As really quickly. We have about 10 minutes left, so feel free, everyone, to submit. So one question that we got a lot was a little bit touching on the privatization of space. So, and maybe we've already touched on this, but so what's to stop governments from stepping in after private industry learns to extract resources from space?
It's actually an interesting question, though, and perhaps we'll cover it in another one. I'm actually less concerned about governments stepping in on commercial initiatives that might be mining resources, and more concerned about other governments stepping in where some governments are interested. If you look at the scope of what's possible, again, we don't know when and if we're going to get to mine this stuff, asteroid mining and all this kind of stuff, or creating things in space. But when one government does it, another one is going to want to do it. And we know that there's all these tensions between China, Russia, the United States, India, and we can cover militarization at a different point. But just now, there are in the last 6 years, I think Japan, China, Iran, Germany, and the US, we've all created space commands. I mean, real space commands and the new battle space of space. And when people were joking about Space Force when it was created, and there's plenty to joke about, it's a very specific type of technology, a very specific type of thinking, and it's really 3D. So yeah, 100%. I think commercial is going to be the least of our worries if governments start fighting about resources. Global spending, nearly $40 billion, I think, in the last year. And remember, US and China are not friendly, and they're the ones that are sort of most powerful in space, even though Russia's making a lot of noise. And I think, Mo, you correct me if I'm wrong, but China's got Tiangong, its own space station. So we're going to start to see right now a lot of defensive capabilities in space. But I think eventually, if we get to offensive capabilities and we break some of the treaties that we've agreed to, it could get really messy. And I think commercial players are probably going to come in after governments in that sense, and because they need to feel secure. This is very expensive equipment. So that's my take.
And then also, I mean, there's a really interesting interview with Elon where he was asked, hey, when you finally get to Mars, is it a SpaceX colony or is it a US colony? And he said, without hesitation, it's a SpaceX colony, which certainly annoyed some people in Washington, considering how much capital and revenue has gone from the government. But it speaks to the broader point that also Boris is kind of talking about and alluding to, which is like we don't have any rules right now. We don't have we have this like old treaty from like the 70s and 80s that like are supposedly supposed to govern all these nations and what we do in space, but we don't have any rules. And I find it hard pressed, considering where our relationships with like the key space powers like US and China are going, that we're going to come to any kind of mutual agreement or coordination anytime soon.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit maybe about something kind of fun and kind of thinking about the next vision for space. What are some of the private commercial applications of space stations in the near future? And is there any cost analysis for feasibility?
I'll take that one. I think we could probably spend a whole webinar on just that topic, but just to I think summarize or just give, I guess, a little bit of background to everyone. Basically, I think what's happening is the ISS, which has been around since 1999, is reaching the end of its useful life, and it's going to be decommissioned by 2030. And right now, there's no government plans to come in and build a successor. So what you've seen is this proliferation of companies like Lockheed Martin and Axiom and Blue Origin and Sierra Space all come out and say, we're going to build private space stations, and have all kind of submitted their own proposals and are all at different stages of building these space stations. I think the initial revenue in the very beginning for all of these companies, at least in the first decade of their operation, is going to continue to be government dollars, right? So NASA, even codified back in like 2020 that they are committed to sustaining a human presence in low Earth orbit. So I think on government contracts alone, there's probably billions of dollars worth of revenue available per year. The commercial applications are still very new, but they can include everything from private space flight services for tourists, and there's already missions like that are planned for this year. Commercial microgravity research that takes place in space stations, and there's already precedence for this. There are companies like Adidas and Honeywell that have actually commissioned research projects in a microgravity environment on the ISS. On the cost feasibility point of that question, I think that's certainly I think something that's still being debated. The ISS costs something like $100 billion to build. And you have current estimates on the newer commercial space stations that are in the single-digit percentages of that budget. So anywhere between like 2 and 10 billion versus 100 billion. And that may seem really unbelievable when you really hear that for the first time, but just keep in mind, NASA actually predicted that the Falcon 9 rocket would have cost them $4 billion to build on their traditional approach. And SpaceX did it for a tenth of that cost. So if I was gonna bet on cost structure, I would bet that the commercial space industry is gonna figure out how to make it cheaper.
Wow. Thank you for that, Mo. Another question that we're getting, we've seen a lot of talk about environmental and sustainability this year. Boris, could you tell us maybe how investors who have an interest in sustainability and environmental justice, as well as space, could go about researching companies' activities and plans to make sure that those match with ESG values?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, what happens from space is that we're able to monitor a lot of things in real time. And so things like discovery of new renewables, crop yields that lead to food insecurity and supply chain issues. A lot of this stuff is really hard to notice and predict, and you can build models based on data that you collect from space. It's very, very hard to do it any other way. Although we have been looking at sensors on the ground. There's some really interesting companies that do it, especially in crypto, but nothing beats a satellite, especially some synthetic aperture that can really look and see what's happening through cloud cover. I think I remember Mark Zuckerberg wanted to launch these big balloons that would give, internet access to Africa. I think probably we're going to start to see that happen actually from low orbit, broadband for underserved people everywhere, right? Because access to the internet has been proven to provide a lot more opportunities. So someone reminded me that was Google. Thank you, Eric. So look, the final piece, and this is sort of something that's on a lot of people's mind, is monitoring greenhouse emissions. So when the closer we can get to the problem, the more easier or more straightforward it will be to provide solutions. So renewables, supply chains, crop yields, broadband, greenhouse emissions. I'm sure someone has been thinking about dozens of other things that they can do. And the most interesting thing about this is that I think these are all financially profitable things for investors to invest in. It's not just charity. There's a lot of money to be made from governments, organizations, and commercial enterprises that want to provide these services to underserved people.
Great. Thank you for your take on that. Sounds like that's a lot going on. Is there any important trends that we should be looking out for this year in particular? Mo, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I would say, the most exciting, what I'm really, really paying attention to is the orbital test of Starship, which is SpaceX's heavy lift launch vehicle. Once it's operational, it's going to be the largest rocket ever built and designed, and SpaceX intends for it to be fully reusable, which we've never seen the likes of anything like this. The company's been testing prototypes for the last couple of years and has practically retired most of the key risks. If they're successful in their orbital test, and there's really no reason to believe that they're not, I think it's going to be unprecedented. It's going to dramatically change mass, cost, and design requirements and constraints for the entire aerospace industry. I think the question, and just to tie it back to an earlier question on commercial space stations, the question earlier on cost analysis feasibility for space stations almost becomes irrelevant at that point, because if you can drop launch costs from where they are today, which is about $2,000 a kilogram, where they were 30, 40 years ago, which is 50 to 60,000, we're now down to 2,000. And at its cheapest, Starship may bring down costs to $200 or even $50 a kilogram. So I would definitely put that on my calendar to watch this year. We don't know yet when it's going to happen. It's probably going to be the back half of this year, but certainly one to pay attention to.
Sorry, thank you guys. Thank you guys. That was incredible. I know we're almost out of time. Thank you both for your insights. I know we could keep answering questions all afternoon, but I'm going to end us on a fun one to send us off. Mo and Boris, I'd love to hear both from you what your favorite space movie or TV show is.
Oh man, definitely for me, Independence Day. If you give me enough time, I'll recite Bill Pullman's speech, but that was a legendary movie. So I'll go with that. Everyone go to YouTube and Google his speech. One of the best ones, and it's in a movie.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's Interstellar. Love that movie. I think that was the last time I remember crying. when Matthew McConaughey came back from, I think it was Miller's Planet, and realized that like 30 years had gone by on Earth. Brilliant movie.
Yeah, nothing gets the waterworks going like Matthew McConaughey. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Boris and Mo. This was an incredible session. Thanks for your insight. Republic is working hard to provide opportunities for retail investors to invest in the space industry. So make sure you create an account on republic.com. And anyone that signed up for this webinar, you'll be the first to hear more about space-related investment opportunities as they arise. Again, thanks everyone for joining. We've recorded this session. We'll send a replay out in the next few days. And thanks again. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you joining.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Kelly.
All right. Yep. Thanks, everyone. Bye.